My name is Edward Bennett, and I'm 65 years old. This is the story of something that happened to me in the summer of 2022, an experience that changed my life forever. I've been a park ranger in the vast Kingsley Forest Reserve in Arkansas for over 3 decades. It's a job that keeps me connected to nature, far from the bustling city life, which suits me just fine. My days were usually filled with patrolling trails, helping lost hikers and observing wildlife, but that summer, everything changed. It was a crisp morning in late June when it all began. I was at the ranger station, sipping my coffee and catching up with my colleague, Scott Anderson. Scott had just returned from a 2-week vacation in the Rockies, and we were swapping stories when our radios crackled to life. A group of hikers had stumbled upon an abandoned campsite deep in the forest, well off the marked trails. Finding deserted campsites wasn't uncommon, but something about this report made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Scott and I loaded up our gear and headed out in our trusty Jeep. The drive along the winding dirt roads was familiar, the dense canopy of oak and hickory trees creating a tunnel of green above us. We parked at the Maple Grove trailhead and began our hike. The forest was unusually quiet that day, with only the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird call breaking the silence. After about an hour of hiking, we reached the reported site. What we found made my stomach churn. The campsite looked like it had been hit by a tornado. A tent lay collapsed and torn, its contents spilled across the forest floor. Food containers were strewn about, some half-eaten and others unopened. Personal belongings, clothes, books, a camera, were scattered in a wide radius around the central area. Jesus, Scott muttered, crouching down to examine a backpack. Wallet's still here, Edward. Who leaves without their wallet? I scanned the area, a sense of unease growing in the pit of my stomach. Someone in a big hurry, I replied. Let's check the immediate surroundings. They might still be nearby. We split up, keeping within shouting distance of each other. I moved towards the edge of the clearing where the trees grew denser and the shadows deeper. There was a palpable sense of being watched, but I tried to chalk it up to nerves. After about 20 minutes of searching, Scott called out, Edward, found something. I made my way over to where he stood, holding up a hiking boot. It was caked in mud and looked like it had been violently torn off someone's foot. Christ, I breathed. Maybe they got injured. Scott nodded grimly. We should call for a search team. This doesn't look good. We radioed in our findings and headed back to the Jeep, the forest seeming to close in around us as we walked. That night, a full search and rescue team combed the area but found nothing. No tracks, no signs of struggle, nothing to explain the hasty departure. The next few days were a blur of paperwork and follow-up investigations. The campers were identified as the Walters family, a group of 4 from Little Rock who had been reported missing by relatives when they failed to return from their trip. Despite our best efforts, we couldn't find any trace of them beyond that abandoned campsite. A week later, we received another disturbing call. This time, it was from a couple who had been camping near the same area. They reported strange noises at night, and more alarmingly, finding their campsite ransacked in the morning. The husband mentioned seeing a dark figure watching them from the tree line just before dawn. Scott and I geared up once again, this time carrying our service firearms and extra supplies as we hiked towards the couple's campsite. The forest felt different. The usual chorus of birds and insects was absent, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press in on us from all sides. We reached the site in the late afternoon. Like the first one, it was a scene of chaos. Gear strewn about, food containers ripped open, a palpable sense of panic lingering in the air. We decided to set up a temporary base and stay the night, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever had spooked the couple. Night fell, and the forest grew impossibly dark. Scott and I took turns keeping watch, but nothing happened until just after midnight. I was on duty when I heard it, a rustling in the underbrush, followed by a low, guttural sound that was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Scott, I whispered, shaking him awake. Do you hear that? He was instantly alert, grabbing his flashlight and gun. The rustling grew louder, coming from the direction of the densest part of the forest. We moved closer, our lights trained on the source of the noise. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with a gaunt frame and skin that. Its skin looked almost translucent in the beam of our flashlights, its eyes reflecting the light with an unnatural silvery sheen. "What the hell is that?" Scott muttered, raising his gun. Before I could respond, the creature lunged at us within human speed. Scott fired, but it barely seemed to notice the impact. It knocked him to the ground, clawing at him with long, bony fingers. I raised my gun and fired twice, the shots echoing through the silent Kingsley Forest Reserve. The creature let out a high-pitched wail that sent shivers down my spine, released Scott, and fled back into the trees, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. Scott was shaken but mostly unharmed, save for some scratches and bruises. We decided to abandon the campsite immediately and head back to the station. As we hiked, we kept our guns ready, eyes constantly scanning the forest for any sign of the creature's return. Back at the station, we reported the encounter, but our supervisor, Dan, was skeptical. "You sure you didn't just see a bear?" he asked, though his tone suggested he knew as well as we did that no bear moved like that or looked so unnatural. "It wasn't a bear, Dan," Scott insisted. "This was something else, something I've never seen before." The next few weeks were tense. We increased patrols in the area, but the creature didn't reappear. Slowly, the forest seemed to return to normal, the usual sounds of wildlife filling the air once more. But the memory of that night stayed with us, a lingering sense of unease that we couldn't shake. Then, about a month after our encounter, another report came in. A young couple, Kevin and Lisa Thompson, had gone missing while hiking in the eastern part of Kingsley Forest Reserve. Their car was found parked at the Maple Ridge trailhead, but there was no sign of them beyond that. We organized a search party, combing the forest for any clues. We found their campsite on the second day of the search. It was abandoned like the others, with signs of a hasty departure, but no indication of where they might have gone. It was as if the forest had swallowed them up, leaving no trace. Scott and I continued our patrols, but the sense of dread grew stronger with each passing day. We were no longer just park rangers. We were men haunted by the unknown, by a creature that defied explanation. Then one evening, as the sun was setting, we received a call from the station. A local hunter, Jim Richards, had reported seeing a strange creature near Black Fork Ridge, not far from where the Thompsons had gone missing. We grabbed our gear and headed out, determined to put an end to this nightmare. The drive was silent, both of us lost in our thoughts. We reached the area just as darkness fell, the forest cloaked in deep shadows. We moved cautiously, our flashlights sweeping across the trees and underbrush. Jim had marked the spot where he'd seen the creature on his GPS, and we made our way there, every sense on high alert. Suddenly, we heard it, that same low, guttural sound that had haunted my dreams for weeks. We turned our lights in the direction of the noise, and there it was, standing at the edge of a small clearing, watching us with those eerie glowing eyes. "Spread out," I whispered to Scott. "We need to corner it." We moved slowly, trying to flank the creature. It stood unnaturally still, almost as if it was waiting for us. Then, with a burst of speed that seemed impossible for its gangly frame, it charged at Scott. He fired, but the creature was too quick. It knocked him down, its claws slashing at his chest. I raised my gun and fired 3 times in rapid succession, hitting it square in the torso. The creature let out a piercing scream and fell to the ground, its body twitching and convulsing. I rushed to Scott's side. He was bleeding from several deep gashes, but was alive. We radioed for help and waited, keeping our guns trained on the creature's body. It didn't move, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly dead, just waiting. Help arrived within the hour, and we were taken back to the station. Scott was patched up and sent to the hospital for further treatment. I gave my report, describing the creature in as much detail as I could. The creature's body was taken away for examination, but I never heard what became of it. It was as if the whole incident was swept under the rug, filed away in some dusty cabinet labeled unexplained. In the weeks that followed, Kingsley Forest Reserve seemed to return to normal. Hikers and campers returned, unaware of the terror that had stalked these woods. But I knew better. There was something out there, something that didn't belong in our world. I continued my work as a park ranger, but I was always on edge, always watching. Scott eventually left the job, unable to shake the fear that had taken root that night. I understood, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Kingsley Forest Reserve was my home, and I felt a responsibility to protect it and the people who came to enjoy its beauty. Years have passed since that summer, and the memory of the creature has faded for most, but not for me. Every now and then, I catch a glimpse of something in the shadows, a flicker of movement that sends my heart racing. I know it's still out there, waiting, watching, and I know that one day it will return. The forest changed me, made me wary, always on guard, but it's also my home, and I will do whatever it takes to keep it safe, even if it means facing that creature again. Because some things can't be explained, can't be understood, they just are, and all we can do is be ready when they come for us. As I sit here in my cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains, I can't help but wonder what else might be hiding in the depths of these ancient forests. What other secrets does this land hold? I may never know the full truth of what happened that summer, but I do know this. The world is stranger and more mysterious than we can imagine. And sometimes the best we can do is stand our ground and face the unknown with courage and determination. So, if you ever find yourself hiking through Kingsley Forest Reserve and you feel a chill run down your spine or hear a strange noise in the distance, remember my story and remember that not all that wanders in the woods is lost. Some things are right where they want to be, waiting for the unwary to stumble into their domain. Stay safe out there and keep your eyes open. You never know what might be watching from the shadows. My name is Arthur Simmons and I am 72 years old. The story I'm about to tell you happened about 5 years ago when I was working as a park ranger in Evergreen Trails National Forest. Now, I know what you're thinking. Being a park ranger sounds like a dream job, right? Leisurely strolls through the woods, rescuing the occasional kitten from a tree, and basking in the beauty of nature. Well, let me tell you, it's not all sunshine and wildflowers. There are things out there in the wilderness, strange and unexplainable things that no one warns you about when you sign up for the job. But before I get into all that, let me tell you a bit about myself. I grew up in a small town called Elmbrook, nestled in the heart of Arkansas. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the biggest excitement was the annual Fall Festival. My childhood home was a modest two-story house on the outskirts of town, backing up to a dense forest that seemed to stretch on forever. From as far back as I can remember, I was drawn to the outdoors. While other kids were glued to their TV sets or video games, I was out exploring the woods behind our house, building forts, and pretending to be a great explorer. My dad, Charles Simmons, was an avid hunter and outdoorsman. He taught me everything he knew about tracking, survival skills, and respecting nature. Some of my fondest memories are of the two of us trudging through the woods at dawn, watching the forest come alive around us. As I grew older, my love for the outdoors only intensified. It seemed natural to turn that passion into a career, and being a park ranger felt like the perfect fit. It wasn't about hunting or conquering nature, but about preserving it and helping others experience its wonder. So, after high school, I enrolled in a forestry program at the State University and never looked back. Fast forward a few decades, and there I was, Senior Park Ranger Arthur Simmons, proud protector of Evergreen Trails National Forest. It was a vast expanse of wilderness covering over 1.2 million acres of diverse ecosystems, from towering pine forests to hidden waterfalls and deep, mysterious caves. Evergreen Trails had it all, and for nearly 30 years, it had been my home away from home. The events I'm about to recount took place in mid-September, just as summer was giving way to fall. The weather was starting to cool down, bringing with it that crisp, invigorating air that always made the forest feel more alive somehow. The leaves were just beginning to turn, splashing the canopy with hints of gold and red. It was my favorite time of year, a time when the forest seemed to hold its breath caught between seasons. On that particular day, I was on a routine patrol, just a standard check of the northern trails. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, a mixture I'd come to love over the years. It's the kind of smell that makes you feel alive, connected to something bigger than yourself. I had my usual gear with me, a radio clipped to my belt, a well-stocked first aid kit in my backpack, and my old trusty compass. I wasn't armed that day. Honestly, in all my years as a ranger, the most dangerous thing I'd encountered was a particularly ornery raccoon with a taste for camper snacks. The day started normal enough. I checked a couple of campsites, making sure no one was leaving trash behind or disturbing the local wildlife. I chatted with a few hikers, giving them tips on the best trails and reminding them of the park rules. It was the kind of day that reminded me why I loved my job so much. Being out in nature, helping people, and feeling like I was making a difference, however small. Around midday, I decided to head towards an old, less traveled path in the northern part of the park. This trail had been closed off for a while due to some fallen trees, but was on my list to check if the work crew had cleared it yet. As I made my way down the overgrown path, I noticed something odd. The usual symphony of forest sounds, birds chirping, leaves rustling, small animals scurrying about, was conspicuously absent. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I shrugged it off at first, figuring it was just one of those weird natural lulls that happen sometimes. But as I continued down the path, the silence began to feel oppressive, almost unnatural. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After about an hour of walking, I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. There, nestled in a small clearing, was an old cabin. Now, I've been working these woods for nearly 3 decades, and I knew every inch of evergreen trails like the back of my hand. But this cabin, it wasn't on any of our maps, and I'd never seen it before in all my years here. The structure was clearly abandoned, its wood gray and rotting, windows shattered and empty. Vines had started to reclaim it, creeping up the walls and across the sagging roof. It had an eerie vibe about it, like something out of an old ghost story. But more than scared, I was curious. In my experience, abandoned structures in the middle of nowhere often held interesting stories and sometimes valuable historical artifacts. I approached the cabin cautiously, my boots crunching on the carpet of dead leaves that surrounded it. The porch creaked ominously under my weight as I made my way to the front door, which was hanging off its hinges, swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. I pushed it open, wincing at the loud groan of rusted metal. The interior of the cabin was a study in decay. A thick layer of dust covered everything, and cobwebs stretched from corner to corner like a macabre tapestry. The air was stale and musty, carrying the unmistakable scent of abandonment and rot. Sunlight filtered through the broken windows, illuminating dancing motes of dust and casting long shadows across the floor. Despite its dilapidated state, I could see that the cabin had once been someone's home. There was an old iron stove in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs in the center of the room, and the remains of what looked like a bed frame against the far wall. But what caught my eye was an old leather-bound book sitting on the table, its cover worn and pages yellowed with age. Curiosity piqued. I made my way over to the table, my footsteps echoing in the empty room. I picked up the book carefully, half expecting it to crumble to dust in my hands. But despite its age, it seemed relatively well preserved. I opened it gently, revealing page after page of handwritten entries. It was a journal. As I flipped through the pages, my eyes widened. The journal was filled with strange entries about local legends and sightings of a creature called the Varanid. The descriptions were vague and often contradictory, but it was clear that whoever wrote this believed wholeheartedly in its existence. One entry caught my eye. May 15th, 1952, saw it again today, the Varanid. It was down by Crystal Creek, just at dusk. Tall as a tree it was, with limbs like branches and skin pale as moonlight. It moved so fast, silent as a shadow. I tried to follow, but it vanished into the mist. I know folks think I'm crazy, but I know what I saw. The Varanid is real, and it's out there, watching us. The last entry in the journal mentioned something about a hidden cave deep in the forest where the Varanid supposedly lived. I couldn't help but chuckle, thinking it was just the ramblings of some old hermit with too much time on his hands and an overactive imagination. Still, something about the journal intrigued me. I decided to pocket it, figuring it would make for an interesting read later. As I stepped back outside, the silence hit me again. It was even more pronounced now, an almost tangible weight pressing down on me. The shadows seemed longer, darker somehow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I decided it was time to head back to the main trail and call it a day. That's when I heard it, a rustling noise coming from the dense underbrush to my left. It wasn't the normal sound of a small animal moving through the leaves. This was different, bigger. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. "Anyone there?" There was no answer, just more rustling, louder this time. I moved closer, my heart starting to beat a little faster. As I approached, the noise stopped abruptly. Everything went still again. I stood there for a moment, scanning the area, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just trees and shadows. Shrugging it off as an animal, probably a deer, I turned to leave. That's when I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a flash of movement, something tall and gaunt slipping between the trees. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The rational part of my brain tried to explain it away. A trick of the light, a shadow, maybe a bear standing on its hind legs. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone out here. Slowly, I backed away, keeping my eyes fixed on the spot where I'd seen the movement. I reached for my radio, intending to call for backup, but all I got was static. The signal was dead, of course it was. I picked up my pace, trying to stay calm, but feeling panic start to rise in my chest. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just trees and lengthening shadows as the sun began to dip towards the horizon. By the time I reached the main trail, I was practically jogging. That's when I saw it again, standing at the edge of the trail, partially obscured by the trees. It was tall, easily over 7 feet, with long, gangly limbs and pale, almost translucent skin. Its eyes were dark and hollow, staring right at me. I froze, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was like something out of a nightmare, like the creature from the journal had stepped right off the page and into reality. I took a step back, and it moved, matching my pace. That was all it took. I bolted, running faster than I ever had in my life. I could hear it behind me, its footsteps unnaturally quiet for something so large. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I didn't dare stop. I could feel it getting closer. Up ahead, I saw the ranger station, a small building where we kept supplies, and a more powerful radio. I pushed myself harder, praying I'd make it. I burst through the door and slammed it shut behind me, locking it for good measure. I grabbed the radio and tried to call for help, but it was still nothing but static. I cursed, banging it against the table in frustration. That's when I heard the scratching at the door. It was here, and it wanted in. I looked around frantically for a weapon, anything to defend myself with. There was an old hunting rifle mounted on the wall, a relic from the early days of the park. I grabbed it, checking to see if it was loaded. 2 rounds. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The scratching turned into pounding, the door shaking on its hinges. I backed up, aiming the rifle at the door, my hands trembling. The wood splintered, and the door burst open. The creature stepped inside, its hollow eyes locked on me. I fired, the sound deafening in the small room. The bullet hit it in the shoulder, but it barely flinched. I fired again, this time aiming for its head. The creature staggered back, letting out a high-pitched shriek that made my blood run cold. It wasn't dead, but it was hurt. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I bolted out the back door, running for my truck parked nearby. I jumped in and fumbled with the keys, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, speeding down the dirt road. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the creature chasing me, but there was nothing, just the dark road behind me and the deepening shadows of the forest. I didn't slow down until I was miles away, my heart still pounding in my chest. I made it back to the ranger station and reported what happened, but no one believed me. They said I must have imagined it, that it was probably just a bear or something. I knew better. I'd seen the Branded, and I knew it was real. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those hollow, dark eyes staring at me. I quit my job a week later. I couldn't stand being in the forest anymore. I moved to the city, figuring there was safety in numbers. Years have passed, but I've never forgotten. I still have that journal tucked away in a drawer. Sometimes late at night, I'll take it out and read those entries, trying to make sense of what happened. But the truth is, I'll probably never know. The forest holds its secrets close, and some things are better left unknown. I've told this story a few times, but no one ever believes me. They laugh, say I've got a vivid imagination. Maybe they're right. Maybe it was just a bear, and years of solitude in the woods had finally gotten to me. But deep down, I know what I saw, and I know I'm not the only one. People go missing in those woods all the time, and not all of them are ever found. I still get nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat with the memory of those hollow eyes burned into my mind. I've tried to move on, to forget, but it's always there, lurking in the back of my mind. One night, not too long ago, I was watching the news and saw a report about a hiker who went missing in Crescent Forest. They found his campsite, but no sign of him. His friend said he just vanished without a trace. The authorities chalked it up to a wild animal attack, but I knew better. The forest has its own rules, its own ways of dealing with those who venture too deep, and the Ranid, it's part of that. It's the embodiment of the wild, untamed spirit of the woods. A reminder that no matter how much we think we've conquered nature, there are still things out there beyond our understanding. As I sit here, an old man now, far from the forests of my youth, I can't help but wonder, was it real? Did I really see what I think I saw? Or was it all just a product of an overactive imagination and too many years alone in the woods? I don't know if I'll ever have the answers, but one thing's for certain. I'll never look at the forest the same way again, and neither, I suspect, will you. I threw myself into research, spending hours poring over local folklore and legends, searching for any mention of a creature that matched what I had encountered. The journal I had found in the cabin became my constant companion, its weathered pages offering tantalizing hints, but no concrete answers. It was during this time that I met Dr. Evelyn Blackwood, a professor of folklore and mythology at the State University. I had reached out to her department, hoping to find someone who might take my story seriously. To my surprise, she agreed to meet with me. Dr. Blackwood was a small, wiry woman with sharp green eyes and a shock of silver hair. She listened to my story without interruption, her face betraying no emotion. When I finished, she sat back in her chair, studying me intently. "Mr. Morgan," she said finally, her voice soft but firm, "I've heard many stories in my years of study, but yours is something different." I felt a glimmer of hope. "You believe me?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I believe that you believe what you saw, and I believe that there are things in this world that defy our understanding. What I can tell you is that your story bears striking similarities to legends I have encountered in my research." Over the next few hours, Dr. Blackwood shared with me tales from various cultures. Native American legends of forest spirits, European folklore about creatures that lurked in the deep woods, and even modern urban legends about mysterious beings in national parks. The details varied, but the core remained the same: tall, otherworldly creatures that seemed to be guardians or embodiments of the wilderness itself. "The name Ranid," she mused, "I haven't encountered before. But the concept, that's as old as humanity's relationship with the wild." As fascinating as our discussion was, it left me with more questions than answers. Dr. Blackwood promised to look into it further and keep in touch, but as I left her office that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled onto something far bigger and more ancient than I could comprehend. The next few months were a blur. I couldn't bring myself to return to work at Evergreen Trails. The very thought of those dense woods filled me with a primal fear I couldn't shake. I took an extended leave of absence, citing stress and health concerns. My superiors were understanding, if a bit confused. I had always been the steady one, the reliable old-timer who never took a sick day. Now, I was a shell of my former self. I threw myself into research, spending countless hours in libraries and online forums, searching for any information I could find about creatures like the Ranid. I even reached out to other park rangers across the country, discreetly asking if they had ever encountered anything unusual in their forests. Most of the responses I got were polite dismissals or concerned inquiries about my well-being, but there were a few, very few, that gave me pause. A ranger in the Pacific Northwest spoke of shadow people glimpsed between the trees. Another, in the Appalachians, described finding inexplicable, enormous footprints that disappeared into solid rock faces. Nothing concrete, nothing that could be proven, but enough to keep the embers of my conviction burning. It was during this time that the nightmare started to evolve. No longer was I simply reliving my encounter in the woods. Now I found myself lost in vast, primordial forests, the trees towering so high their tops were lost in mist. And always I could feel eyes upon me. Not malevolent precisely, but utterly alien. Watching, waiting, judging. I would wake from these dreams drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, the scent of pine and damp earth, so strong I could almost believe I was back in evergreen trails. It was after one such night that I made my decision. I had to go back. The drive back to evergreen trails was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Every mile closer made my palms sweat and my heart race, but I knew I had to face this. I had to know for sure if what I had experienced was real, or if I had finally cracked after all my years in the wilderness. I arrived at the ranger station early in the morning, before most of the staff had arrived. Jake, the night shift guy, was just about to leave when I walked in. He did a double take when he saw me. "Henry, what are you doing here, man? Thought you were on leave." I forced a smile. "Just came to pick up some things I left behind. Mind if I grab my old gear?" Jake shrugged. "Sure thing. Good to see you, Henry. You've been missed around here." As I gathered my old pack and gear, a wave of nostalgia hit me. This had been my life for so long. The familiar weight of the pack on my shoulders, the creak of my well-worn boots. For a moment, I was tempted to just slip back into my old routine, to pretend that nothing had ever happened. But I couldn't. I knew what I had to do. I left a note for the chief ranger, explaining that I was going to do one last patrol of my old route. Then, with a deep breath, I stepped out onto the trail and into the forest. The woods were as beautiful as I remembered. Dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy, the air rich with the scent of pine and wildflowers. For the first few hours, I almost managed to convince myself that everything was normal, just another day on the job. But as I approached the area where I had encountered the Ranid, the atmosphere began to change. The bird songs grew fewer and farther between. The air seemed to thicken, making each breath a conscious effort. And that feeling of being watched returned, prickling at the back of my neck. I found the old cabin easily enough. The cabin looked more decrepit than I remembered, as though it had aged decades in the months since I'd last seen it. The door hung open, swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. With trembling hands, I pulled out my flashlight and stepped inside. The interior was just as I remembered, dusty, covered in cobwebs, and frozen in time. But the journal was gone. In its place was a single sheet of yellowed paper. On it, written in spidery handwriting, were the words, "The Ranid watches. The Ranid waits. The forest remembers." A chill ran down my spine. I hadn't told anyone about the journal. How could this paper be here? That's when I heard it, a rustling noise from outside, too loud to be a small animal. My heart began to race. Slowly, feeling as if I were moving through molasses, I turned toward the door. There, framed in the entrance, was a figure, tall, impossibly tall, with limbs like gnarled branches and skin as pale as birch bark. Its eyes, dark hollows in its face, fixed on me with an intelligence that was alien, yet undeniably present. The Ranid. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I waited for the fear to return, for the panic that had overwhelmed me during our last encounter. But instead, I felt calm, as if I were in the presence of something ancient and powerful. Not benevolent, but not inherently malevolent either. Slowly, deliberately, the Ranid raised one long, fingered hand and pointed deeper into the forest. Then, as silently as it had appeared, it turned and melted into the shadows between the trees. I stood there for what felt like hours, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Part of me wanted to run, to flee back to civilization and never look back. But a deeper part The part that had called me to the forest in the first place all those years ago, knew I had to follow. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of the cabin and into the deepening shadows of the forest. Whatever lay ahead, whatever truths I might uncover, I knew my life would never be the same. The forest had called, and I had no choice but to answer. As I ventured deeper into the woods, following the path the Ranid had indicated, I couldn't help but feel I was walking into something far bigger than myself. The forest around me seemed to hum with an energy I had never noticed before, as though it were alive in a way I could only now begin to understand. The trail I followed was barely visible, more of a game path than anything made by human feet. It led me through dense underbrush, across babbling streams, and past ancient trees whose trunks were wider than my arm span. All the while, I felt watched, guided, herded towards some unknown destination. As the day wore on and the light began to fade, I found myself in a part of evergreen trails I had never seen before. The trees here were different, older, more gnarled, their branches twisting like grasping fingers. Moss hung in thick curtains, and the ground beneath my boots was soft and spongy. Quite suddenly, I emerged into a clearing. At its center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk easily 20 feet in diameter. Its branches spread in all directions, creating a canopy that seemed to encompass the entire clearing. But it was what lay at the base of the tree that took my breath away. Nestled between two enormous roots was a cave entrance. It was perfectly round, as though carved by human hands, yet I knew instinctively that no tool had shaped it. Runes or symbols of some kind were etched around the opening, glowing faintly with a light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my own heartbeat. As I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, already knowing what I would see. The Ranid stood at the edge of the clearing, its tall form blending seamlessly with the ancient trees. But it wasn't alone. As I watched, other figures began to emerge from the forest. Some were tall and spindly like the Ranid, while others were squat and gnarled, resembling ancient tree stumps brought to life. Some appeared to be made of mist and shadow, while others looked as solid as the rocks and earth. They formed a loose circle around the clearing, their otherworldly eyes all fixed on me. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, as though everything, the trees, the earth, these strange beings, even the very air itself, was waiting. The Ranid stepped forward, its movements fluid and graceful despite its gangly form. It raised one long arm, pointing toward the cave entrance. The message was clear. This was why I had been brought here. This was what I needed to see. With a deep breath, I stepped toward the cave. As I approached, the symbols around the entrance glowed brighter, and I could feel a thrumming energy emanating from within, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. I paused at the threshold, looking back at the assembled beings. The Ranid nodded, a surprisingly human gesture from such an alien creature. Taking another deep breath, I ducked my head and stepped into the cave. The moment I crossed the threshold, the world seemed to shift. The air became thick and heavy, filled with the scent of loam and ancient things. The walls of the cave were smooth, almost polished, and covered in more of those strange glowing symbols. As I ventured deeper, the cave opened into a vast chamber. In the center was something indescribable, a pool of liquid starlight, swirling and pulsing with colors I had no names for. Images flashed across its surface: forests, mountains, deserts, oceans. I saw creatures both familiar and alien, civilizations rising and falling, the earth transforming over eons. In that moment, I understood. This was the heart of the forest, not just evergreen trails, but all forests, all wild places. It was the wellspring of life itself, the source of the magic and mystery that humans had sensed in nature since the dawn of time. And the Ranid, along with the other beings I had seen, were its guardians, ancient spirits preserving and protecting this vital force from those who would exploit or destroy it. I stood there, lost in the swirling visions of the pool. Time felt meaningless. Minutes, hours, or days could have passed. Then I felt a gentle touch on my shoulder. The Ranid stood beside me, its hollow eyes conveying a depth of emotion I hadn't thought possible. Slowly, it reached out and touched the surface of the pool. The liquid light clung to its fingers, and then it turned to me and gently pressed its hand to my forehead. In that instant, everything changed. Knowledge flooded into me. The language of trees, the songs of stones, the whispered secrets of the wind. I saw the world as the Ranid did, a vast, interconnected web of life and energy. I understood the vital role wild places like evergreen trails played in maintaining the balance of the world, and I understood why I had been chosen to serve as a bridge between humanity and the ancient spirits of nature. When the vision faded, I found myself back in the clearing, the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. The other beings were gone, but the Ranid remained. It nodded to me one last time before turning and vanishing into the forest. I made my way back to the ranger station in a daze, my mind reeling from all I had experienced. I knew my life had irrevocably changed, that I could never go back to being the man I was before. In the years since that night, I've done my best to fulfill the role given to me. I returned to my job as a park ranger, but with a new purpose. I've become an advocate for conservation, using my experiences to help others understand the true value and wonder of our wild places. I've worked with scientists and researchers, bridging the gap between empirical knowledge and the ancient wisdom I was given. It hasn't been easy. Many still don't believe me. They think I'm just a crazy old man with wild stories. But that's okay. I know the truth, and I do what I can to protect it. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full, I'll venture deep into the woods of evergreen trails. There, in the shadowy spaces between the trees, I'll catch glimpses of tall, otherworldly figures. A reminder that the world is far more vast and mysterious than we can imagine, and that the wild places still hold secrets beyond our understanding. So the next time you're in a forest and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense of being watched, remember my story. Remember that there are guardians in the wild places, ancient and powerful. They're watching, waiting, protecting the heart of nature itself. And who knows? Maybe, just maybe, they'll choose to reveal themselves to you too. But be warned, once you've seen the truth, there's no going back. The forest will forever call to you, its secrets whispering on the wind, inviting you to delve deeper into the mysteries of the natural world. It's a call that, once heard, can never be forgotten. As for me, I'm just grateful for the glimpse I've been given, for the role I've been asked to play. I'm Henry Morgan, former park ranger, now guardian of secrets and teller of tales. And this is my story. My name is George Wallace, and I am 68 years old. This is a true story about something that happened to me a few years back when I was working as a park ranger at Sleeping Giant State Park in Connecticut. I had been a ranger for nearly 20 years at that point, and I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing prepared me for what happened that autumn. It was a chilly October evening, and I had just finished a long day of patrolling the trails and making sure the campgrounds were clear of litter. The park was quiet, as it usually was this time of year, with only a few campers braving the cold nights. I was looking forward to a warm meal and maybe a beer or two before heading to bed. Around 8 p.m., I got a call on my radio. It was Sarah, one of the newer rangers. She sounded panicked, her voice shaky. She told me there was something weird going on at the northwest edge of the park near the old quarry. Sarah was usually level-headed, so her distress worried me. I grabbed my flashlight, radio, and my old Glock 19, just in case. I drove my Jeep through the winding park roads, the headlights cutting through the dense fog that had settled in. I could see the silhouette of the old quarry in the distance, a gaping wound in the side of the mountain. As I got closer, I noticed Sarah's Jeep parked haphazardly on the side of the road, its lights still on. But Sarah was nowhere to be seen. I called out for her, but there was no response. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. A bad feeling began to form in my gut. I decided to check the quarry, thinking maybe Sarah had gone inside to investigate something. The place had a reputation for being dangerous, especially at night. As I approached the entrance to the quarry, I noticed something odd, strange markings on the ground, as if something heavy had been dragged into the quarry. Despite every instinct telling me to turn back, I followed the trail inside. The air grew damp, heavy with the smell of moss and wet stone. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the rocky walls. "Sarah, you in here?" I called out, louder this time. There was no answer. I moved deeper into the quarry, my hand hovering over my gun. The dragging marks led to a narrow crevice in the rock face, a spot I had never noticed before. The opening was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I hesitated, my heart pounding, then pushed forward. The crevice opened into a small cavern. The air here was colder, carrying a strange metallic tang. My flashlight beam swept across the walls and caught something reflective on the far side. As I approached, I realized it was a symbol etched into the rock, a series of interlocking circles and lines that seemed to shift and ripple when I wasn't looking directly at them. A faint noise broke the silence, a whimper coming from deeper in the cave. My pulse quickened as I moved cautiously toward the sound, my heart hammering in my chest. Rounding a corner, I saw her, Sarah, huddled against the wall, her eyes wide with terror. "George," she croaked, her voice trembling. "Thank God. We need to get out of here. Now!" I was about to ask her what had happened when another noise cut through the air. This one was closer, a low, guttural growl with an unnatural metallic edge to it. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the shadows, and that's when I saw it. A figure stood in the darkness, tall and humanoid, but with features that were grotesquely wrong. Its skin rippled, shifting between polished metal and rough stone. Its eyes glowed with an eerie blue light, and where its mouth should have been, there was only a dark void. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. Instinct took over. I fired my gun, the noise deafening in the confined space. The creature let out a shriek that sounded like grinding metal and lunged toward me. I dodged to the side and fired again, this time hitting it square in the chest. It staggered but didn't fall. Instead, its form seemed to dissolve into the shadows, disappearing from sight. Wasting no time, I grabbed Sarah's arm and bolted. We stumbled through the dark cave, out into the open quarry. The fog had thickened outside, reducing visibility to just a few feet. My breath came in gasps as we ran for my Jeep. I practically threw Sarah into the passenger seat before jumping in myself. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, speeding down the winding park roads. Back at the ranger station, I called for an ambulance and tried to calm Sarah enough to get her talk. Between gasps, she told me she'd seen strange lights in the quarry and went to investigate. That's when the creature appeared, chasing her into the cave where she'd hidden until I arrived. The ambulance arrived, taking Sarah to the hospital. I filed my report, but I knew no one would believe the truth. I barely believed it myself. Over the next few days, I searched the park for any sign of the creature, but it was as though it had vanished into thin air. Sarah recovered from her injuries, but she was never the same. She left the Park Service, moving to another state to put as much distance as possible between herself and Sleeping Giant. I stayed on, but I was more cautious, always looking over my shoulder, always listening for that strange metallic sound. I never saw the creature again, but every time I passed the old quarry, I felt its presence, lurking just out of sight. I started calling it the Stone Shifter, a name that seemed to fit. My research turned up old legends about beings that lived deep in the mountains, neither fully flesh nor stone. Most dismissed them as myths, but I knew better. About a year later, while patrolling the park one quiet evening, I saw a light in the distance. It was coming from the direction of the quarry. My heart skipped a beat, a chill running down my spine. I hadn't been back there since that night with Sarah, but something compelled me to investigate. I drove as close as I could and continued on foot, moving quietly through the trees. The light remained, a strange, pulsing blue glow. As I got closer, I saw a figure standing near the quarry's entrance. It was an old man, his face deeply lined and weathered, his gaze fixed on the glowing symbol I had seen inside the cave. Now, The symbol was etched on the rock face outside, its blue light pulsing faintly. "Sir, are you okay?" I called out to him, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked into the quarry. Against my better judgment, I followed, my hand gripping my gun. Inside, the air was charged with an energy that made my skin tingle. The old man stood by the crevice, staring into it with a mix of fear and longing. "They're coming back," he said suddenly, his voice a raspy whisper. "Who's coming back?" I asked, but before he could answer, the light flared brightly. When it dimmed, the old man was gone. In his place stood the stone shifter, its form rippling and changing in the eerie blue glow. Its hand, sometimes flesh, sometimes stone, sometimes glistening metal, reached toward me. I backed away, my heart racing. I was in the presence of something ancient, something that existed long before humanity and would likely persist long after we were gone. The stone shifter didn't advance, though. It simply stood there watching. That was the last time I visited the quarry. I stayed on as a ranger until retirement, but I avoided that area of the park and made sure others did too. The stone shifter, the glowing symbol, and the strange energy remained unexplained. I was content to keep it that way. Sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind blows just right, I think I can hear a faint metallic whisper carried on the breeze. And I wonder what ancient secrets are still sleeping in the heart of the mountain, waiting to wake. The arrival of autumn heralds the coming of winter. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting the forest in a palette of reds, oranges, and golds. I was working the morning shift, which meant I was up before dawn, ready to start my rounds as the sun peaked over the horizon. Evergreen Trails isn't one of those famous national parks that draw tourists from all over the country. It's a smaller, state-run affair, mostly visited by locals who appreciate its quiet beauty and well-maintained trails. After 5 years on the job, I thought I knew every inch of those woods like the back of my hand. I was wrong. That morning, my first task was to check the perimeter fence on the north side of the park. It was about a 2-mile hike from the ranger station, but I didn't mind. The walk gave me time to wake up and enjoy the crisp morning air. With a thermos of coffee in one hand and my radio in the other, I was ready to call in if I found any damage or signs of trespassers. As I made my way along the fence line, a thick fog began to roll in. It wasn't unusual for this time of year, but it always made me uneasy. The way it muffled sounds and limited visibility, like walking through a world of cotton wool. I was about halfway through my inspection when I noticed something odd. A section of the fence about 10 feet long was completely mangled. This wasn't just broken or cut. It looked like something had torn through it with incredible force. The metal links were twisted and bent, and the wooden posts were gouged deeply, as though clawed by something massive. Frowning, I knelt to examine the damage. This wasn't the work of an animal I recognized. Bears could do significant damage, sure, but this looked deliberate, too precise for mere instinct. Keying my radio, I called, "Hey Marge, you there?" Marge Olson, my colleague and closest friend at the park, responded almost immediately. "Morning, Arthur. What's up?" "I found some strange damage on the north fence," I said. "Looks like something tore right through it." "Any reports of unusual activity or large animal sightings?" There was a pause before Marge replied. "Negative on both counts." "You think it's vandals?" I hesitated. "I'm not sure. It doesn't look like typical vandalism. I'm going to investigate a bit further. It might take me a while to get back." "Roger that, Arthur. Be careful out there, and keep me posted." I clipped the radio to my belt and took a deep breath. The sensible thing would have been to wait for backup, but curiosity won out. I decided to follow the trail of destruction, hoping it would lead me to some answers. Stepping through the mangled fence, a shiver ran down my spine. It was colder on this side, and the fog was thicker. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, rustling leaves, the scurrying of small animals, were conspicuously absent. The silence pressed down on me, broken only by the crunch of leaves under my boots. I followed the trail of broken branches and disturbed earth for about a quarter mile. The fog made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead, and I nearly lost the trail several times. Eventually, I stumbled into a small clearing, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. It was a campsite, or what remained of one. 2 tents lay in tatters, shredded beyond repair. Camping gear was scattered everywhere, sleeping bags, backpacks, cooking equipment. And there was blood, not a lot, but enough to know someone had been hurt. My heart pounded as fear and adrenaline coursed through me. I scanned the area, looking for any sign of the campers, but the clearing was deserted. With shaking hands, I reached for my radio again. "Marge, I found something," I said, my voice trembling. "A campsite, completely destroyed. There's blood." Marge's voice came back, tight with concern. "Jesus, Arthur, are there any victims? Do you need backup?" "No sign of anyone yet," I replied, taking another look around. "Let me check for clues before we call it in. Might be nothing." "Arthur, this doesn't sound like nothing." "Be careful, okay? I will." I promised. I started to examine the campsite more closely. The tents were beyond saving, but I found a backpack that was mostly intact. Inside were a map of the park, some energy bars, and a wallet. The ID belonged to a Mark Jensen from Minneapolis. I made a mental note of the name, thinking we'd need to contact his family. As I zipped the backpack shut, something caught my eye. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the fog, was a set of tracks leading deeper into the woods. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before, too large to be human, but clearly bipedal. Each print was nearly 2 feet long, with claw marks extending from elongated toes. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn back, to radio for help and wait for backup. But if there were injured campers out there, every minute counted. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow the tracks. The trail led me deeper into a part of the forest I rarely visited. The trees here were older, their gnarled branches stretching out like arthritic fingers. The fog clung to everything, turning the world into a gray, formless void. The tracks became harder to see, and I began relying more on intuition than sight. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed meaningless in that mist-shrouded forest, but eventually I emerged into another clearing. This one was smaller than the first. At its center stood an enormous oak tree, its trunk easily 10 feet in diameter. The tree looked ancient, its bark twisted into shapes that almost resembled faces. At the base of the tree, I saw more blood and what appeared to be scraps of torn clothing. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I moved closer, my flashlight cutting through the fog, and then I saw it. Crouched at the base of the tree was something. At first it looked almost human, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized how wrong that impression was. The creature was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that were too long and bent at unnatural angles. Its mottled gray skin rippled, shifting as though it couldn't decide on a solid form. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. They were enormous, taking up far too much of its face, and so dark they seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight. When its eyes locked onto mine, a chill deeper than any physical cold ran through me. It was as though something essential, some core piece of my humanity, had been stripped away in that instant. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Then, faster than I could blink, it moved. One moment, it was crouched by the tree. The next, it was gone, disappearing into the fog with a speed that defied belief. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. "Arthur, Colleen, you've been silent for over an hour. What's going on? With trembling hands, I raised the radio. Marge, I saw something. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't natural. I'm heading back now. You're scaring me, Arthur, she said. Just come back to the station. We'll call the authorities and sort this out. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, not caring about stealth or betrayal. I just wanted to get as far away from that clearing as possible.